When everything is taken away, what is left? When the world you have carefully built around you crumbles into dust, would your faith remain? This is a question that echoes through the deepest chambers of the human heart, a whisper in times of peace, and in times of turmoil. It probes the very foundation of what we believe and why. We find comfort in blessings, seeing them as signs of favor and love. But what happens when those blessings vanish all at once, like a candle extinguished by a sudden harsh wind? In that profound darkness, the true nature of our spirit is revealed. Imagine a life so full of light and joy it seems almost perfect. A life blessed with abundance, with a loving family, and the respect of everyone around you. This was the world of a man named Job. He lived a life many would dream of, a life of peace and great prosperity. His days were filled with the laughter of his children and the rewards of his hard work. His heart was full of gratitude. He walked with integrity, believing in a God who was good and just. Job's story begins not in sorrow, but in immense blessing, a testament to righteousness and devotion. But even the most serene landscapes can be reshaped by unforeseen storms. The story of Job is about what happened when blessings were put to the ultimate test, a journey from the highest peaks of human happiness, down into the deepest valleys of suffering and loss. It forces us to confront pain, grief, to ask why good people suffer, and to search for meaning when all seems lost. His journey mirrors our own struggles, reflecting the fragility of our world and the enduring strength of the human soul. We will walk with Job through his remarkable story, witness his unwavering character in times of plenty, and stand beside him when his world is torn apart. This is more than an ancient tale, a timeless exploration of faith, suffering, and the mysterious ways of God. It invites us to look beyond circumstances, to find hope not tied to what we have, but to who we trust. Join us as we delve into the life of Job, a man whose faith was tested by fire, refined through loss and sorrow, and renewed by unshakable hope. In the moments ahead, we will see his blessings, the sudden trials that shattered them, the questions that rose from grief, and the answer that came from God. Stay with us now as his story unfolds without pause, and discover the profound resilience found in a faith that endures all things. In the ancient land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. He was not a king or a great warrior, but his reputation was known far and wide. He was a man of perfect integrity, a man who feared God and turned away from evil. His life was a portrait of divine favor, painted with the vibrant colors of happiness and peace. Every morning as the sun cast its first gentle rays across the desert sands, Job would rise to pray. He offered thanks for his family, for his health, and for the abundant wealth that filled his days. His devotion was not a performance for others to see, but a quiet daily conversation with his Creator, a relationship built on love and reverence. Job's greatest treasures were not his herds of livestock or his vast fields, but his 7 sons and 3 daughters. Their home was a place of constant celebration and joy. Their bonds were strong, and their love for one another was deep. Job cherished his children above all else, and his heart swelled with pride whenever he saw them together. He was a father who cared deeply for their well-being, not just in body but in spirit. He would often pray for them, consecrating them in his heart, asking God to watch over them and keep their paths straight. His life was a testament to the beauty of a family rooted in faith and mutual affection. Beyond his family, Job's blessings were immense. He owned thousands of sheep and camels, hundreds of oxen and donkeys, and had a great number of servants who tended to his lands. He was the wealthiest man in all the East, but his riches did not corrupt his heart. Instead, he used his wealth with wisdom and generosity, known for his kindness to the poor and his fairness to all. His gates were always open to the traveler, and his hand was always ready to help those in need. His prosperity was not a source of pride, but a wellspring of gratitude, a responsibility he carried with humility and grace. Thus, Job lived in a state of tranquil contentment, surrounded by the clear evidence of a blessed life. His days were ordered and peaceful, his nights were restful, and his heart was at ease. He had everything a person could desire: a loving family, great fortune, and a sterling reputation. He was a righteous man living in a world that seemed to reward his faithfulness at every turn. It was a life that seemed unshakable, a fortress of peace built on a foundation of unwavering faith. But the winds of change were beginning to stir, preparing to test that foundation in ways no one could ever imagine. The day of Job's undoing began like any other. The sun rose over the land of Uz, casting its familiar golden light upon the peaceful landscape. Job's children were gathered at the home of their eldest brother, sharing in one of their customary feasts, their laughter echoing in the distance. Job himself was likely attending to his affairs, his heart at ease. There was no sign, no warning, no hint of the devastating news that was about to shatter his tranquil world. The first crack in this perfect facade appeared in the form of a single, breathless messenger. The man came running, his face etched with terror and his clothes torn from a frantic journey. He burst into Job's presence, gasping for air, the words tumbling from his lips in a torrent of panic and despair. He told a story of sudden and brutal violence, while the oxen were plowing the fields and the donkeys were grazing peacefully beside them. A band of Sabaean raiders had descended upon them. They had swept in without warning, a whirlwind of destruction, stealing the animals, striking down the servants with the edge of the sword. And I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. The words hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. In a single swift attack, a significant portion of Job's livelihood had been wiped out. 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys. The servants, men who had worked alongside him for years, had been slaughtered without mercy. The shock of the news must have been immense. It was a violation not just of his property, but of the very sense of security and divine protection that had always enveloped him. Yet even as Job tried to process this first wave of catastrophe, he still had his thousands of sheep, his legions of camels, and most importantly, his beloved children. This was a tragedy, but it was not the end of his world. The first messenger had barely finished speaking when another figure appeared on the horizon, running with the same desperate urgency. Before the dust had even settled from the first messenger's arrival, a second runner appeared, his face a mask of horror. He did not wait for Job to speak, words spilling out of him in a frantic rush. This was not human violence, but a terrifying act of nature from the heavens. He spoke of the sheep. Out in the pastures, fire from God had fallen from the sky. It rained down on the flocks and the servants, consuming them in an unearthly blaze. And I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. The scale of the loss was escalating at incomprehensible speed. The news was almost too fantastic to believe. Fire from the sky? It felt like a direct strike from a supernatural force. Job's mind must have been reeling. First, the Sabaeans, and now this. One an act of human greed, the other an apparent act of God, both linked by devastation and terrifying proximity. The foundations of Job's world began to crumble. No time to mourn, no breath to catch. As the trembling second messenger stood, a third arrived. News from another direction. The Chaldeans, fierce, organized, formed 3 companies. They swept down on the camels. They drove off all 3,000 camels. They killed the servants who cared for them. And I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. In moments, Job was reduced from the wealthiest man in the East to a man of no substance. His oxen, his donkeys, his sheep, his camels. His servants all dead. His life's work utterly obliterated. The speed and totality were beyond comprehension, as if the world conspired against him, leaving him standing amid the ruins, stripped of everything he owned. Just when it seemed that the torrent of loss could not possibly get any worse, the fourth and final messenger arrived. This man's face bore a different kind of anguish. Not just the terror of a survivor, but the profound sorrow of one who carries the heaviest news. He was the bearer of a loss that could not be measured in livestock or land. This last one would shatter his heart. He approached Job, voice choked with grief, and delivered the final, unthinkable blow. He spoke of Job's children, his 7 sons and 3 daughters, all together, feasting in their eldest brother's house. While they were eating and drinking wine, a mighty wind rushed from across the wilderness. A wind of immense, unnatural power struck the 4 corners of the house, and the structure collapsed inward. The weight of roof and walls came down in an instant. The messenger paused, grief-stricken, then spoke Job's worst fear. They were all gone. All 10 of them. His 7 beloved sons and his 3 cherished daughters, the center of his world, were dead. The house of celebration had become their tomb. Joy and laughter were silenced, forever, buried under rubble and dust. And for the 4th and final time, the messenger delivered the devastating line, "And I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." This loss transcended all others, A man can rebuild his fortune, but he cannot replace his children. This news did not merely strip Job of possessions, it tore out his heart and his future. The lineage he had prayed for, the children he had consecrated, extinguished in a single, cruel moment. The silence that followed was the most profound and deafening silence, a void filled with echoes of all-encompassing loss. The initial shock gave way to a new and terrible reality. Job was not only stripped of his wealth and his children, but his own body became the next battleground. His ordeal was not to be confined to external losses, it was about to become deeply and excruciatingly personal. A new affliction fell upon him, one that he could not escape, one that attacked his very flesh. Painful, agonizing sores broke out all over his body. They covered him from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head, a relentless and tormenting plague that left no part of him untouched. His life, once filled with comfort and honor, was now reduced to the most basic and miserable existence. He was driven from his home and found himself sitting among the ashes. There he sat, day after day, an outcast. In his agony, Job took a piece of broken pottery, a potsherd, to scrape himself. This simple, desperate act speaks volumes about the intensity of his suffering. The itching and the pain must have been unbearable. This image is one of profound misery and degradation. His own wife, who had shared in his blessed life and now shared in his catastrophic loss, could not comprehend his endurance. Seeing him in his wretched state, she came to him not with comfort, but with a bitter and despairing challenge. Do you still hold on to your integrity? Curse God and die. But even in this, Job was being tested, his suffering compounded by the despair of the one person who should have been his closest ally. In the aftermath of these compounded tragedies, word of Job's plight began to spread. It reached the ears of his three closest friends. Amber Munri Eli Elandibro Ysin Vivri Azi Tha Ditan Tha Dindi Mi Manit Bildad the Shuhite, Zophar the Namathite. They made a pact to journey to him together, to show him sympathy, to offer him comfort. They came to mourn with him, they came to sit beside him, they came to share the burden of his grief. When they finally arrived and saw him from a distance, they almost did not recognize him. He was a mere shadow of the friend they had known. The sight was so shocking, their own grief overwhelmed them. They began to weep aloud. They tore their robes in mourning, they scooped up dust and threw it over their heads. Then they sat down on the ground with him, and they said nothing. For 7 days and 7 nights, they sat in complete silence. They did not offer easy platitudes. They did not try to explain away his suffering. They simply sat with him in his pain. Their silent presence testified to the depth of their friendship. They understood his grief was too profound for words. This week of shared silence was a profound act of empathy. Their willingness to enter Job's desolation was the greatest comfort they could offer. It created a space where Job's grief could exist unexamined. A brief moment of peace before the long debates about his suffering began. After 7 days and 7 nights of profound, shared silence, the weight of unspoken grief finally became too much to bear. It was Job himself who broke the stillness. He opened his mouth, not with a cry of anger, but with a curse directed not at God, but at the very day he was born. It was a lament that poured forth from the depths of his soul. "Let the day perish on which I was born," he cried. He wished for that day to be plunged into darkness, for no light to ever shine upon it. He longed for it to be blotted out from the calendar. This was not a rejection of his creator, but a profound expression of his wish to have never existed, to have been spared the unbearable agony he now endured. Why did I not die at birth? In his mind, an early death would have been a kindness. He envisioned the quiet rest of the grave, where the wicked cease from troubling and the weary are finally at rest. The grave, so often feared, had become for him a desirable haven. This initial outcry was not an attack on his faith, but a raw and honest display of his humanity. It was the sound of a heart breaking under an impossible load. Job was not denying God's existence or power. Rather, he was grappling with the brutal reality of his situation. He was giving voice to the darkness that had enveloped him, a darkness so complete that it made him long for the oblivion of the unborn. This was the beginning of his struggle, a verbal wrestling match, not just with his friends, but with the very meaning of suffering, in a world he had always believed to be governed by a just and benevolent God. After the long and arduous debates between Job and his friends had fallen into an exhausted silence, the very atmosphere began to change. The sky began to darken, a wind began to stir, a great storm, a whirlwind, formed. It was from the heart of the tempest that the long-awaited voice finally spoke. It was the voice of the Lord. The voice was not gentle or soothing. Instead, it was a voice of immense power and authority. It addressed Job directly, challenging him and upending the conversation. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? The question reached everyone who had tried to explain the inexplicable. God entered the debate, not to be judged, but to be the judge. Brace yourself like a man, the voice commanded. I will question you, and you shall answer me. The roles were now completely reversed. Job, who had wanted to put God on trial, was now called to account. It was a moment of profound, terrifying awe. Job, who had defended his integrity and demanded his day in court, now faced the plaintiff, the judge, the jury. All his justifications faded before the Creator's power. The real answer was about to begin. Not an explanation, but an education in divine wisdom. God did not begin by addressing Job's personal suffering. Instead, he began a grand tour of the cosmos. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding. Who determined the earth's measurements? Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its bases sunk? Who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Had you ever commanded the morning, shown the dawn its place, entered into the springs of the sea, walked in the recesses of the deep, known the storehouses of the snow, seen the treasuries of the hail? These were not questions expecting a literal answer. They were poetic and powerful illustrations of a world filled with mystery and wonder. God was not belittling Job, he was expanding his vision. God then turned Job's attention to the animal kingdom. He asked Job about the wild mountain goat. He spoke of the wild donkey. He described the powerful wild ox. The questions became even more pointed. God spoke of the ostrich. He then described the magnificent war horse. And then came the great beasts, Behemoth and Leviathan, creatures of immense power and might that no human could ever hope to tame or control. This tour of creation served a profound purpose. If Job could not understand the ways of the ostrich or the wild donkey, how could he possibly presume to understand the ways of their creator? The lesson was one of deep humility. Faced with this overwhelming display of divine power and creative genius, Job was finally silenced. Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? He finally whispered, placing his hand over his mouth. He had spoken once, even twice, but now he would speak no more. He had wanted answers, but what he received was a revelation. He got a renewed and infinitely deeper understanding of the God who had allowed it. And in that humbling encounter, his perspective was forever changed. After the voice from the whirlwind fell silent, a new kind of quiet settled over the land, a peaceful stillness born of profound humility. Job now stood in awe, his heart transformed by the encounter. He spoke again, not to argue or defend himself, but to confess the smallness of his own understanding. I know that you can do all things, he said to God. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. He acknowledged that he had been the one speaking of things he did not understand. This was not a repentance for some hidden sin, it was a repentance for his pride. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Before, his faith was based on tradition. Now his faith was based on a direct, personal and overwhelming experience of God's majesty. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes, he declared. He was no longer just a man in pain, but a man made humble. He had found his answer, in the character of God himself. His struggle was over, replaced by a quiet and profound peace. God then turned his attention to Job's 3 friends. He rebuked them. You have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Fortsätt eintained alla dafter bässen. God instructed them to take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to Job, who would then offer a sacrifice and pray for them. God promised to accept Job's prayer on their behalf. In this, Job's integrity was publicly vindicated. The man who had been accused and condemned was now made the intercessor for his accusers. After Job had prayed for his friends, the Lord began to restore his fortunes. The season of testing was over and a new season of blessing was about to begin. The Lord blessed the end of Job's life more than his beginning. Where he once had 7,000 sheep, he was now given 14,000. Where he had 3,000 camels, he now had 6,000. His wealth was doubled. More precious than any material wealth, Job's family was also restored to him. He was blessed again with 7 sons and 3 daughters, a gift of new life and new joy. And his new daughters were said to be the most beautiful women in all the land. Job gave them an inheritance among their brothers, a progressive and generous act that reflected his own gracious and transformed heart. Job lived to see his family grow and prosper for many generations. He lived for another 140 years, long enough to see his children, his grandchildren, and even his great-grandchildren. His life, which he had once cursed, was now filled with a deep and lasting peace. He had passed through the darkest valley, and had emerged on the other side with a faith that was profoundly real. And so, after a long life, Job died, an old man, satisfied with the journey he had completed. Job's story is a timeless echo that speaks to the deepest parts of our own journeys. It is a powerful reminder: the path of faith is not always one of ease and comfort. Sometimes it leads us directly into the heart of the storm, into valleys of profound loss, into seasons of unbearable pain. The world may tell us suffering is a sign of failure, but Job's life teaches a different lesson. It shows us that in the crucible of our greatest trials, our faith is not destroyed, instead purified, strengthened, and made real. His journey moved from a faith of hearing to a faith of seeing. We may never understand every reason behind our sorrow. Like Job, we may cry out into the silence, asking questions with no easy answers. His story invites us to shift our focus, move beyond the need to understand the why, and place our trust in the who behind it. A God whose wisdom is as vast as the cosmos. True faith is not the absence of questions, but the choice to trust. The ultimate message of Job is unshakable hope. Even after the most devastating losses, restoration is possible. Our darkest chapters do not have the final say. Faith is not a shield from pain, but an anchor in the midst of it. Hold on to your integrity. Be honest in your struggles. Never stop seeking the face of God. You are not alone in your trials. A faith that weathers the storm leads to deeper trust and a more profound experience of God's grace and restoration. If this message touched your heart, subscribe to Walking in Faith and continue this journey of faith.